So now we are going to begin with the presentations with Pauline Kranendonk, who is our first speaker. She's a feminist activist living in Luxembourg.
I want to talk about the impact that our language and gender ideology language has on women's rights. And when we talk about gender ideology and its impact on women's rights, we need to be sure that we use clear language. We can't convey what we mean if we don't use clear language. I'm going to just share my... It's important to use clear language, and we cannot advocate for our rights if we don't use clear language. And so I'm going to take a look at a few basic terms from gender ideology, the basic tenet being gender identity, and we have, of course, all the linked terms that are basically derived from that core tenet of a gender identity, which is, for example, transgender, cisgender. I mean, I'm sure you can complete the list. We all know these terms. I want to take a look at this core tenet, as I said, of gender identity, and I have randomly looked for several definitions. As you can see, they have, there's one from Merriam-Webster Dictionary, one from Human Rights Campaign, and one from the United Nations. And what they all have in common is an inner feeling. They have different ways of describing it, different words, but they're all about an inner sense or an inner feeling or a soul. And they all link this to sex implicitly. They talk about being male or female, which are concepts linked to sex, but at the same time, sex is denied because this is now an inner feeling only. So there is a paradox inherent to all of these definitions, and you can look for any definition that you want, but they will all have these elements in common, that the existence of sex is denied, and at the same time, it is replaced by an inner feeling that is now renamed gender. So what is the effect of this paradox that is inherent to this notion of gender identity, which lies at the basis of gender ideology? The effect is that we feel confused and we feel insecure, and our worldview is shaken, because we have always believed that the human species has two sexes and that you can't change sex. And this is challenged, and we try to understand it, but these definitions and these descriptions are so vague and paradoxical that you can't really rationalize them. So this messes with your brain. You have no reality to link it to, you can't observe it, and you have to accept something that you don't understand. And at the same time, there is pressure from authoritative sources, there is propaganda through different media, Netflix, TV, social media, what have you. And as I said, authoritative sources, which I will show in a moment. And all this pressure, and the fact that, combined with the fact that you're unable to really have an understanding of what is being explained to you, and the pressure on having to accept those notions regardless, is what I call a mindfuck. And I don't mean to analyze gender identity jargon, gender ideology jargon, but I do want to discuss how these changes in language are impacting us and what pitfalls and dangers there are when we use that jargon. And I want to answer 3 questions. How has gender ideology impacted our language? And it's still doing that. What are the pitfalls and the dangers of using that jargon, especially for feminists? And how can we avoid those pitfalls and dangers? So here, for example, you see Pamela Harris's Twitter bio, where she has included her pronouns. Not that anyone would have had any doubt that she was a woman, but what she is really doing is saying, I embrace gender ideology. And that is the message that she is sending through her bio. It's kind of coded language in a way. Here you see President Biden addressing Congress for the first time, and he is saying that he will support, and he's specifically addressing young people, that he will support the transgender community and that they are very brave and that he supports them. And you can see that Kamala Harris and Nancy Pelosi are getting up, and the entire Congress got up to applaud that. You can also see in the title, this comes amid a wave of state bills targeting transgender people. So this is the way this is framed, that when there are laws being passed to protect, for example, women's spaces, this means you're targeting transgender people. Here we have Justin Trudeau, who is for Sisters in Spirit Day, which is a day to honor and to commemorate the lives of Indigenous women and girls who have gone missing or have been murdered. And he actually adds a completely unpronounceable, it's not even an abbreviation, but just a combination of letters, let's say, which caused him a lot of, to be mocked a lot, I think. But it's quite telling that a prime minister of a large country uses this language. And this, by the way, I found it interesting that for the same Sisters in Spirit Day last year, he simply referred to Indigenous women and girls. So you see this development in 1 year. Well, there are celebrities as well who promote gender ideology. Here we see that Ellen Page changed her name and decided that she wanted to be referred to as male, and immediately her Wikipedia page was changed. Every single article referred to her as a man, and even Netflix, I think, changed the credits to her ongoing show. He is transgender. This is the way we are supposed to accept that it is possible to change your sex, or that you can completely deny the existence of sex. You also see his authentic self, which is part of the narrative as well, that to change your body and to change, to deny your own sex actually means to accept that you are who you really are. Here you have nature.com, that's a biomedical research journal. So it's supposed to be science-based. This is a peer-reviewed study, and you would think, I mean, it's quite an important topic because they're studying whether there is an increased rate of autism among people who are diagnosed, I suppose you could say, or who self-identify as transgender or gender diverse. These are the terms that they use. You can see that this introduction is entirely riddled with gender identity jargon. And you even see, for example, the term cisgender, which is supposedly defined in a very vague way to refer to individuals whose gender corresponds to their sex assigned at birth. So these are already, this is a medical journal which talks about the idea that somebody is waiting to see a baby when it's born and decide what sex it is, kind of like the sorting hat, I guess, in Harry Potter. This is another study into HIV prophylactic medication. This is from ABC News, and the study itself also described it like, described the population as men who have sex with men, transgender women who have sex with men, as if that were a completely separate category. And I suppose it could be true if you have a group of men who take cross-sex hormones, for example, or who have had surgery, that they might have a different reaction to medication. But we know that a lot of the men who refer to themselves as transgender women don't do that. So it's also not scientifically accurate. And then they use the horrific term Black cisgender women, relegating Black women to a subclass of their own sex. Here we have the law. There are quite a number of laws that have now, in different countries, that have now accepted gender ideology in their language. This is the Belgian gender identity law that allows self-identification, as it is called. And so you can decide your own sex, and you can have even your birth certificate change retroactively. And this assumes that there is an actual intimately lived gender identity or intimately experienced gender identity. And you will note as well that the entire text of the law uses only the masculine. So I'm sure there will be some indignant outrage about the misgendering of half the population in this law. but that must have escaped people's attention, I guess. Here we have dictionaries. This is just one example, but basically all the dictionaries have included gender ideology language incorporated it into their dictionaries. It's a purely descriptive definition, whereas I think a lot of women, especially those who are a bit better informed about this issue, take offense at being called cisgender. And you see, it's just a very objective and neutral description. I just compared it just for fun with the description of heathen, which does have a mention that it is disapproving or offensive. And yeah, so the word cisgender is simply accepted as a regular term. Here we have the Green Party from the UK, who always have embraced a gender ideology and are happy to push this language on others. Trans women are women. I mean, it's kind of dogmas really that they kind of mantras that they repeat. And then we have, which I always find a little bit disappointing, you have celebrities, sometimes very respected people or authors, or can be from or sports people or from any walk of life. And they will come out and slam feminists and women's rights activists for speaking out in favor of women's rights and for naming the risks and the dangers of gender ideology for women's rights and for girls. And in this case, it was Emma Thompson. And you can see that the feminists are being referred to as trans exclusionary. So the word feminist just completely disappears. The word women also disappears. And it's a letter in support of trans rights. And this is a narrative that you see a lot, that if you stand up for women's rights, you must be opposing trans rights. So it's kind of a reversal that takes place. At the same time, of course, it's said that the rights are not a pie, and that they can all you can all have rights, and they won't conflict with each other. This is from Webmd, so this is like an A to Z glossary from Webmd, and it has a very, I would say, very subjective definition of what is already a nonsensical term, cisgender. But it is being described very, very seriously. So you can see, even in the medical world, these terms are being used as if they were very neutral and not ideological at all and not subjective at all. Then we have the other issue, not just the new language that is being introduced that we are expected to adopt, but also our own language that is being erased. I think we all know many examples, and this was a very extreme one, I think, where Ruth Bader Ginsburg, after her death, her quote was rewritten by the ACLU, which used to be a civil rights organization, but I suppose it's a men's rights organization now. And it just erased women completely from her quote. These 4 screenshots are from, the 2 on the left are from an article about cervical cancer and the importance of getting pap smears, where the word woman is avoided. So we're called anyone with a vagina or someone with a vagina, individuals. You even see, I don't know if you can see this here, figures show around 1 in 4 don't go to their smear tests. That's actually 1 in 4 women. But as they lift out the word women, which apparently was a no-go, it sounds like it's 1 in 4 people, which is a completely false statistic. When you look to the 2 on the right, this was also on the BBC, so the same website, 3 days before, I think, prostate cancer, and you see the word men used consistently in the article. And you also see, for example, 75% or 3 in every 4 men. So correct statistics being used. This was an example of what I personally find a very shocking use of language, Black birthing bodies instead of mothers or pregnant women. And you can see in the article that other language, other terms are also used that come from gender ideology. I'm happy to say the person who owns this website did refer to her mother as her mother, so I guess that's a positive thing. These were just examples, by far incomplete, and this list that you see here now is also not exhaustive. I think we could go on for quite a while, but We've seen some examples now of who uses the language of gender ideology. So it's used in academia, it's used by universities, it's used in the medical world, in studies, and by physicians. By all means, not everyone, but because of course, usually physicians and scientists do know the importance of biological sex. And they know that it's a reality, but there is pressure on them as well to adopt gender ideology jargon. Within companies, including big multinationals, many of them have LGBT programs that promote gender ideology. Governments, including prime ministers, presidents, politicians, ministries, local governments, child protection agencies, human rights bodies, health authorities, legislators. So you see, as I gave the example, there are many laws that now include the notions of gender identity. NGOs, so you have LGBT organizations, children and youth organizations, women's organizations, human rights organizations, crisis centers and shelters, who now adopt this notion that men can become women, and therefore also admit women into women's shelters, for example, and into women's organizations. International organizations like the European Union, the United Nations, WHO, the media, and that includes both mainstream media and independent media, celebrities, so that can be actors, authors, social media influencers, etc., and the education system, and this you see at all levels from preschool to universities. Now, this, I hope I'm not going too fast, by the way, and this is by no means, as I said, a complete list, and it will vary per country. There are some countries where the governments and institutions have been much more captured than other countries, but generally this is a tendency that we see, and some countries may be more advanced in it than others. In most countries, there is a push to institutional capture, as it's called. So what is the impact of the fact that all of these organizations and actors are using this language and are expecting us to adopt that as well? So as I said, it is kind of a mind fuck. So it makes you detach from reality and accept things as truth, even if you don't understand them. And to be forced to accept that paradox that is inherent to gender identity grooms you to accept other things that you don't understand, such as the loss of women's spaces, the fact that any man can enter a space and can sleep next to a woman in a hostel, or can become a member of a women's book club, or or can perform searches on women in the airport, for example. All of these things we are groomed into believing if we accept that paradox because we don't understand, and that is similar to the effect of doublethink, as described in 1984 by George Orwell. The point being, the goal being mind control. So not only are we being forced to accept language that we don't understand, but we also are losing our own language, which is being actively erased. There are forces which are coercing us into adopting the jargon, and there are very real punishments if we don't. So people have been fired and have been put under caution by the police, have been removed by police, have been receiving death threats and rape threats, have been, as we saw last week, which I found extremely shocking to hear, that women were pushed out of their own organizations and called transphobic organizations and events that they had been organizing for many, many years. And this happened with friends. And I think that is very shocking, that you were called a transphobe, and that is just not even a debate. As soon as you are given this qualifier, you're out. So as a consequence, we become afraid to speak our own language, so women-centered language, and we feel that we have no other choice but to adopt gender identity language, which actually is the language of our oppressor. And the strategy is fear. For example, terms like transphobia and trans rights are used in kind of a reversal. So when a woman, as I said, when women speak out in favor of women's rights, they can be called transphobic, even if they're not even talking about, they don't even mention the word transgender or trans. This can be the accusation. And trans rights or human rights, I think many of us feel the need to start any, and I think we've seen this with J.K. Rowling and many others who have spoken out in favor of women's rights and women's spaces. They often start out with a disclaimer that I support trans rights. And I think we need to be very careful when we, because this is again, in fact, adopting gender ideology jargon. I don't believe that the gender identity or the gender ideology movement is really about trans rights. This is not what you see in their activism, if you can even call it that. It's more of aggression and violence towards women and girls in many cases, with the goal to silence women. So we see a lot of threats of violence. We see, for example, slurs like TERF being used very often in combination with threats of violence, often misogynistic violence like rape threats. This is very typical of this movement. And the intention is to shut women up and to make women submit. And once you give up your own language and you adopt the language of the person who is trying to make you submit, that is in a way giving up your resistance. So you are submitting to gender ideology when you adopt its language. So how can we avoid falling into this pitfall? So if we look at the problem, it's a new language that is being imposed on us, newspeak, if you will, and our old language that is being erased. Just like actually in 1984, where literally all the old language was being literally burned. In this case, it's happening differently, but we are being made to understand that we should not use the word woman anymore. And we should use words like vulva owner and uterus haver, menstruator, cisgender woman, all ideological terms that dehumanize and humiliate women, and that are often also incorrect. So if you see that this is the problem, we're imposed a new language that demands our submission and our old language is erased, then it kind of seems like a no-brainer how we should fight this, and that is by retaining and reclaiming our own language, so female-centered language. We need to reclaim the word woman without any further qualification, without explaining that it doesn't include men, because it doesn't include men. That's the whole definition of woman. We should use the word men in the same way, not explain what we mean. We should avoid using words like gender ideology jargon, like transgender, trans, terms like gender identity, unless we really explain what we mean, or we put them maybe in quotes. Because personally, I find if I can't understand a word, if I don't really understand what I'm saying, what it means, and there's so much at stake, I don't want to use those words anymore. So I use the word men. And if I have to qualify, I will say men who say they are women, for example. This is something that I can verify, I can observe. They are saying that they are women. And Dr. Julia Long actually came up with what I think is a brilliant alternative, and that is men who demand that we call them women. And I think that really sums up, it kind of makes apparent the problem with the term trans woman, for example. It calls men women, so it already kind of removes the barrier to including them in women's spaces, because if you're already calling them women, it becomes very, very hard to make the argument that they are not actually women. And if you say men who demand that we call them women, the coercive factor becomes very evident. And so I think that would be a good alternative. And in my experience, it's very often possible to simply call them men. And it makes not only the discussion much clearer, but it also makes your own thinking much clearer. And I think that's the part of what I call the mindfuck, maybe not the, the most respectful word, but the mind control that is actually the goal of this distortion of language. It's kind of a way to gain your sanity and your rational thinking back, because it does have an influence. So generally, we should try to stop using male-centered language. For example, what is a men's rights activist? Is he really, or a trans rights activist? Are they really fighting for trans rights? Are they really activists? I sometimes call them male supremacists, for example. You can come up with your own terms. I think it's important to just be aware of that and the impact that it has when you do adopt terms from gender ideology. Stop referring to men as any kind of women. And just a reminder that fear is the strategy and the end goal is silencing women. And so, although it can be scary to reject this gender ideology jargon and to use female-centered language, we need to be brave and we need to be aware of why we're scared and just do it.